So Japan is one of the biggest distribution hubs for US dollars worldwide. However, it depends on a very sensitive balance between JGB yields, which is the Japanese bonds, and also US bonds. And that balance is now under jeopardy. And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about today on how a crack into that market could spread a tsunami around the world, not only to the US, but also to China, since Japan distributes a lot of dollars into whole Asia, and it's the biggest hub for China as well. So, first off, it's important for us to always come back to the same theme, which is repurchasing agreements. So basically, the way it works for those who are seeing me for the first time, this is the core structure for the whole credit generation and liquidity generation in the markets today. Maybe you're looking for understanding what is going to happen to asset prices, to the to bonds, to stocks, and even and of course mainly Bitcoin. To understand that, we need to understand liquidity, we need to understand the plumbing, and Japan is essential in one of the biggest repo market players worldwide, where because Japan has the most one of the biggest holdings of US bonds worldwide. So whatever happens to Japan can affect the US bond market and can affect liquidity, because the more volatile it is, the less liquidity you get. So we need to make sure those markets are stable. However, it's exactly the opposite of what we're currently seeing. So if you see here, what happens to so most of the concerns are all about the long-term yields in Japan. So this is the 40-year yield. Let me put it back here to so you can see. Perfect. So the Japan JGBs, the 40-year yield, you see here, there's a trend of it going up. It might not look like a lot, but in Japan, you need to remember that we had 17 years of negative interest rates in Japan for JGBs. And not only that, Japanese banks have held on to those bonds that pay negative into their balance sheets. So what happens is Japan was trying to quote unquote normalize its economy, but we all know that the whole world is synchronized into a recession when it comes to real economic activity. But they are trying to get that back to normal. And why is that? There are two reasons. Of course, one would be the narrative. So we are actually reopening the economy. We want to get rid of those negative interest rates, and everything is going to be fine. And we're going to be exporting more because the rest of the world is picking up. That's one thing. However, the other problem is Japan has a very consistent history of manipulating their yield curve by buying their own bonds. So the Bank of Japan, the BOJ, has purchased basically half of its debt, doing sort of a yield curve control, an active yield curve control, where since you buy your own debt, you're able to let it mature into your own balance sheet without affecting anything else, but just dropping those rates down. And again, the more we buy a bond, the less yields it pays. So that's a way for Japan to control. But it comes with a huge trade-off, because if you keep doing that, and if you just go over 50%, for example, why don't I bring those rates down? That creates a lot of liquidity problems for the rest of the market, in which the less liquidity, the less supply you leave of JGBs for the real market, because you're Bank of Japan and buying everything, that creates a lot of volatility. And that's where things start to break. Because before that, back in the days where we have zero interest rates, we would do what we call a carry trade. Basically, you are a Japanese bank, you borrow in yen, in a weaker currency, and you borrow that, you exchange that yen, borrowing dollars for you to be exposed to the US markets, stocks or bonds, buying US bonds and recycling those dollars back into the United States, and also buying Bitcoin with it. So Japan is a lot of the volume from Japan goes into Bitcoin as well. But the problem here is, when you have those interest rates going up, you have the FX risk, the hedge that you normally would have against the yen to go up against the dollar, that could force you out of your position because it doesn't make any sense anymore. Your money becomes way too expensive to bear. So you need to sell off the US bonds to go back to Japan, and that increases the yen against the dollar and also creates a lot of problems and more volatility. So that's basically the mechanics of how it works. And of course, it's a very complicated subject. And every video I try to bring to give you a new tool so you can understand how the monetary mechanics work and how that affect asset prices. But the best way for us to do that, of course, is through our Bitcoin intelligence report that shows everything. So we pour a lot of details into exactly what's going on, not only on-chain analysis, macroeconomic analysis, but also the monetary mechanics part and how that affect Bitcoin and all of your investments, so you can have actionable information on your portfolio. So if you want to have access to that, links are on the description below, and make sure that you use the promo code for 5% off. All right. So having said that, that's that kind of movement that you see in Japan, it does affect a lot of the US market as well. So this is the problem of the contamination, so to speak. It's whether the tsunami from Japan actually hits the United States is when you have to sell off those bonds. So if Japan is basically one of the biggest holders, if not the biggest, outside of the US, of course. And this creates also a lot of volatility, especially on the long end of the curve. This is one of the reasons as well why the 30-year bond yield in the U.S. is also going up, despite of the demand. We also had an auction that happened last week. It was a very good auction. A lot of demand from abroad as well. Going to be talking about that. I'm talking about that on our latest report as well, so you can see the details. But still, a movement from Japan is extremely significant. So we have to keep an eye on what's happening over there, because you also, if you want to have like two very good indicators, it would be, first off, the Japanese bond, of course, the 40-year yield, but also the Japanese yen as well, because when you have to unwind the carry trade, and many carry trades or basis trades, so there are many kinds of trades that Japanese banks, institutions, and also insurance companies, many other institutions who are not only in Japan but also in offshore facilities in London, Ireland. I talk a lot about that on shadow banking as well. It's done a lot by Japan. That is a very important thing. It's not a bad thing. It just creates a lot of credit to the rest of the world. So this is why the JPY, as we call it, the Japanese yen, is extremely important as an indicator to see the flux of that unwind, how quickly that is going. And you can clearly see here that that lately it has been going down. So that means that there's some pressure coming, and not a great one, because normally you would say, if you live in Japan, for example, right now, you have some relief, right? So you earn in yen, and maybe you have a lower inflation expectation based on that, because Japan imports a lot of energy. However, this movement is very defensive. It's not really a movement about the Japanese economy picking up, but more of a defensive movement of a sell-off. However, it's based on the volume and how deep the US bond market is, it's not yet something to be like too concerned about for the time being. So the goal here is just to provide an explanation of the monetary mechanics on what could break if we have something coming from Japan. But China, on the other hand, we can say, for example, you might say, oh, actually, it's the US and Japan are just allies, let them sink together, right? And China is going to just take over. Not really, because China is extremely dependent on that equilibrium, on that balance. And to be frank, you need all of these countries to perform the way they're actually doing, and unfortunately for Japan, for them to be this pillar to continue that distribution of dollars into the euro dollar system, they need to create problems domestically, which has been going on for decades, with the deflation, with the growth that is not helping, and also the demographic bomb that they have to deal right now, along with China as well, and the same kind of problems. So it's a really tough situation to be in, and there is no easy answer to this, because if they can afford to go back to the status quo, because it's just going to stay that way forever, and more people are going to leave, and you're not going to see the growth that you've seen in the country, like in the 90s, for example. But on the other hand, if you just go the other route and let's normalize the economy, let's stop buying those bonds, that creates also a problem. So if the BOJ wants to intervene and all of a sudden they want to buy more bonds, that can compromise that liquidity. So you have less and less JGBs for the market to play with, creating a lot of volatility and also breaking a lot of that carry trade, making that unwind. See how everything, it's like it's extremely interconnected. So this is a huge challenge for Japan, but also the US, maybe the Fed, through Fed swaps or emergency lending, would be able to intervene, or would need to intervene, to make sure that things still stay afloat. So we shouldn't underestimate the ability of central banks and all those discussions that happen between them, and what kinds of new weapons they're going to try to make in order to prevent any kind of collapse on that way. However, the more intervention that you create, the more distortions you're also going to do. However, everything, it's very inflationary in what comes to liquidity, and this drives a lot of that liquidity towards assets like Bitcoin, like gold, like stocks. So this is still very helpful for that liquidity, but it creates more and more distortions over time, creating like a K-shaped economy where people who have assets are the only beneficiaries, and people who just have fixed salaries are just going to be worse and worse off, unfortunately. So let's see the next movements into the Japan and into the Japanese economy, see what's happening to JGBs and also the JPY. All right. So see you in the next video. Thank you so much.